Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Steve Lubar. I'm the moderator of the second session today. I'm a professor of American Studies here at Brown. About 10 years ago, I taught a course on memorials and memorialization. And I distinctly remember telling my students in that class that the challenge of studying memorials is that nobody noticed them anymore. They just had disappeared into the landscape. Providence is full of memorials to World War I, the Civil War, World War II, and nobody noticed them. And they didn't seem important anymore. Well, boy, was I ever wrong. They are in the news all the time. The memorials that seem to be ghosts and just sort of disappeared have suddenly become the topic of newspaper stories and nightly news. We've asked the panelists today to grapple with the question, how should cities use public space to discuss, remember, and confront the legacies of slavery in the 21st century? My instructions from the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice are very precise. I have to give no more than a 5-minute introduction, which I will do. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to talk, and I will remind you after 9 minutes. And then we'll have a 10-minute conversation among the panelists, and then open up to the general question and answers for the public. And then we're supposed to end promptly at 1:15. I'll do a very quick introduction of the panelists, all of them before they start, and then let do their presentations. First bit of, as Tony said, Christy Coleman is not able to make it. Her flight was canceled this morning, and she wasn't able to reschedule. Matt Riley, at the end, is an assistant professor at the City College of New York. He's an anthropological archaeologist who works on Barbados and Liberia, and he's interested, in addition to his historical and archaeological work, to heritage and issues of heritage management. At the heart of his research, he writes, is a critical exploration of the complex relationships between slavery and freedom, colonialism and sovereignty, race, class, capitalism, the social construction of race and structured racism, in the past, present, and future. Mary Nile Mitchells is the Ethel and Herman L. Midlow Endowed Chair in History at the University of New Orleans. She's co-directs the Midlow Center for New Orleans Studies, the author of Raiding Freedom's Child, Black Children, and the Visions of the Future After Slavery, and also one of the 3 lead historians on Freedom on the Move, a crowd-based database of fugitive slave advertisements. Finally, Stacy McCormick is an assistant professor at Texas Christian University, working on a book, A Body Without a Nation, Performing Slavery and Fugitivity in Contemporary Black Drama, that considers how the rise in dramas on slavery and the rise in drama on slavery in the contemporary stage, and the implications of the artistic production, and how we understand the past and negotiate the present. She's currently a Woodrow Wilson Mellon Foundation Career Enhancement Fellow. Matt is first.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to the center, especially to Tony, to Shayna, to Maya, and Sophie, my former student who's currently taking a photo of me. It's always a real treat to come back here, especially for such a fantastic and wonderful event. So today I'm going to combine a little bit of my own archaeological research on the Caribbean island of Barbados with some of my own teaching experiences here at Brown and at my new institutional home at the City College of New York, thinking about linking some of these geographies and specifically materialities, especially since I am an archaeologist. And so I don't go over that 10-minute time I'm going to read, so please humor me as I bore you guys through some archaeological work. As an archaeologist, I approach the topic of slavery and memorialization materially. That is, I focus on the material dimensions of the experience of enslavement while also thinking about monuments as artifacts. For the latter, this means critically thinking about the social climates that inspired the erection of statues and monuments, as well as the counter-memories that challenge the structures of white supremacy. The monuments that so regularly appear in our news feeds and in public debate are powerful artifacts, that call to mind the oft-used invocation that slavery is America's original sin. What I seek to problematize in these few minutes is the way in which debates surrounding Confederate monuments and slavery in the United States have become viewed through the lens of the nation. When the nation, and for our purposes, its cities, become battlegrounds on which these debates unfold, transnational histories can be unintentionally silenced, thus threatening potentially viable and potent remembrances that strive for global reparatory justice. Here at Brown and at my new institutional home, the City College of New York, I have taught courses on the archaeology of slavery with a particular focus on memory and monuments. In each permutation of the course, the city becomes part of the classroom as students explore sites associated with slavery and freedom in their own backyards. In New York City, for example, sites like the African Burial Ground and organizations like the Black Gotham Experience are working to reverse silences surrounding slavery in the city. And my sincere apologies that I won't be able to join everyone tomorrow because it's early tomorrow morning, but I'm actually leading a tour of the African Burial Ground to a group of students. The Black Gotham Experience offers multiple walking tours of the city's financial district, focusing on the role of Africans and African Americans in building the early Dutch and later English colony. Here, there are few visible traces of slavery or the trade, making it difficult to associate the place with the criminal enterprise of slavery or its lasting legacies. As guides point out, the city has done very little to acknowledge this chapter of its past, only erecting this meager sign as testament to the public slave market that was opened in the spot in 1711, thereby minimizing or silencing the dehumanization of Black bodies and the ensuing episode of rebellion that took place the following year when enslaved Africans burned an orchard and attempted a revolt. Instead, key dates and policies associated with slavery in New York are deemed to be the most essential facts about the spot in Manhattan's financial district. This is but one example of countless memorials, monuments, markers, or simple plaques that are intended to materially testify to the significance of slavery at a specific locale. In other words, slavery was an integral part of the history, economy, and society of New York City, Providence, Newport, etc. Markers and monuments often make reference to widespread connections, linking port cities with distant colonies and West and Central African points of departure, but the focus is civic. When dealing with more nefarious monuments, like those erected to immortalize Confederate generals, for instance, we are similarly directed towards themes of national silences, civic disenfranchisement, heritage, and claims to national belonging. So what happens when we attempt to create national or city memorials to monuments to a global crime against humanity that transcended boundaries and engendered circum-Atlantic geographies? The problem I'm highlighting here deals with the ways in which nationalism and an interesting permutation of American exceptionalism is parsing memories of slavery and the slave trade, eliding more entangled histories and material realities. In a variation of the extreme physical violence and torture meted out to the enslaved individuals in the form of dismemberment, I'm here suggesting a metaphorical dismembrance. I've long been involved in archaeological research in the Caribbean island of Barbados, excavating the residences of enslaved men, women, and children who lived and labored on massive industrial sugar plantations. While the findings and insights gleaned from this research are beyond the purview of what we're discussing on this panel, I want to quickly highlight one of the methodological challenges faced by archaeologists working in contexts of sugar and slavery. The Plantation Complex enveloped roughly 90% of Barbados's landscape during the centuries in which sugar production was the economic lifeblood of the colony. Each plantation had a pool of enslaved laborers, many times numbering in the hundreds, who resided in villages on the property. Following emancipation in 1834, however, planters forced the bodies they used to own to the peripheries of their holdings, which were transformed into tenantries, reclaiming the former villages for the purposes of agricultural production. As a result, almost every single village that had been resided in for generations by the enslaved was completely wiped off the landscape, rendered invisible by endless rows of cane. With the advent of deep plowing mechanization, these same fields were sliced, probed, and churned by mechanical blades that disturbed the material vestiges left behind by the enslaved. Archaeologists are left to literally pick up the pieces, traversing plantation fields, recovering vestiges of plantation life. This includes scarred pottery, mangled glass bottles, and fragments of pipe stems. This is a process of re-articulating dismembered bodies and material pasts. It's a practice that, through tangible means, seeks to breathe life into the experiences of the enslaved. So contrary to popular belief, archaeology is therefore not necessarily about empirically determining what happened in the past. Instead, it's about memory, using traces of the past in our present to remember, and the hyphen is important there, those previously denied a history. So the practice itself is a useful analogy or even mnemonic, reminding us to not allow individual pieces to be viewed in isolation. Instead, we should consider the assemblage, another archaeological term. The assemblage comprises goods and bodies from across the globe, interconnected via the heinous realities of capitalism and slavery. The same system that Trinidadian historian and politician Eric Williams so long ago noted to have been the economic catalyst for the growth of the cities in the metropole. Cities and ports in the United States are no different. Their success hinged upon the circuitous trade in goods and bodies from Europe, Africa, South America, and of course the Caribbean. So how do we remember on a more transnational scale? How do we get from the broken pieces of pottery and sugar fields in Barbados to the port cities around the United States? How do we materially bind colony and city in calls for remembrance and reparatory justice? If our monuments and debates surrounding them continue to be insular, we risk repeating, albeit in a very different form, the violence of dismemberment that characterized the institution of slavery. Remembering necessitates an approach that tethers places, people, and things not bound by nation. Now, this, of course, is not without historical precedent, but for a source of contemporary inspiration, we can turn to the new 23-foot I Am Queen Mary statue that was recently unveiled in Copenhagen just a few weeks ago. While approaching slavery through a similarly problematic lens of nation and the post-colony, the statue nonetheless demands that viewers recognize the entangled geographies of struggle associated with the transatlantic trade. The two artists, Jeanette Ehlers and Levon Bell, drew upon the story of three Black women, including Mary Thomas, who led a labor revolt on the island of St. Croix, a Danish colony at the time of the uprising in 1878. Coverage of the unveiling focused on representation, or lack thereof, boasting that this statue now stands in a nation in which 98% of the monuments represented white men. For my purposes, however, I want to draw your attention to Queen Mary's right hand. It's here that you'll notice what's referred to as a cane bill, a sharp metal tool used for the backbreaking work of cutting sugarcane. Rather than promote a single narrative of resistance or victimization, the statue itself calls for a more complicated remembering that embraces the messiness of the assemblage of slavery, from courageous acts of resistance, in this case after emancipation, to the oppressive work routines that comprise daily life for enslaved peoples throughout the Atlantic world. Through acts of remembering, it is possible, in the words of Salamisha Tillett, to, quote, subvert the racial exclusivity of American civic myths and establish new forms of diasporic solidarity, end quote. What I'm suggesting here is by no means an indictment of those who are actively striving to combat stark silences and erasures surrounding acts of racial terrorism that resulted from local and national processes, practices, and policies. Rather, it's an opportunity to materially re-articulate seemingly disparate histories and geographies that could potentially bolster transnational projects of solidarity, reconciliation, remembrance, and reparatory justice. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Tony, for inviting me to join everyone, and thanks to Sheena and to Maya especially for helping organize. I am speaking from the perspective of someone who lives and works in New Orleans, and so much of what I'm going to talk about with lots of slides, so you'll bear with me because I felt it was important to sort of show you the multiplicity of ways in which our city and the people within it are trying to change the narrative of the city. So some of this involves some of the transnational work that the first speaker was just talking about. And some of it involves hyper-local attention to sites within the city. It has become clear that it's not just a question of what monuments should go up or come down, but rather thinking about citizens' relationship to the city around them and making sure that their voices are heard, and that those of us who are working, whether through the university or through grassroots organizations, work alongside the community to ask everyone to look at the landscape a little bit different, or quite a bit differently than we have been. The other layer to this, of course, is that New Orleans is pretty much almost exclusively dependent on tourism. So in addition to combating the sort of larger national narrative of the lost cause, we have a city that is very wedded to the stories it's been telling, and been telling them for a really long time. I'm going to start off, though, actually with something that came from outside to our city this year, which is Kara Walker's Castle of Caravan, or Catastrophe Caravan. Let's see if it will make some noise. Let's see. So that's just a little tiny piece. It ran for 2 or 3 days. She set it up. It's a 32-note calliope, supposed to be sort of like a circus caravan, but it's also in conversation with the steamship Natchez, which goes up and down the Mississippi River. You can see a little tiny piece of the river there behind it. And she timed a series of African-American protest songs, gospel music, Prince, Marvin Gaye, I mean, a really interesting lineup of music programmed into the caravan, and was timed to respond to the whistling and the calliope on the steamship Natchez, right, to sort of take on the sort of old, what I think she called Old Southie, Dixie kind of storytelling that is sort of embodied by the steamship Natchez as a tourist cruiser. And so she says that she was inspired to do this, and this was a part of Prospect 4, which is our biannual, I think, art exhibition in New Orleans, where people from all over the world come and do installations. And she was inspired to do this, she says in her literature, because there was only one small, cheap, I think she called it, brass plaque at the site. She chose that site because it was the embarkation point in the 18th century for enslaved Africans who were coming into New Orleans. And this is the plaque that she's referring to. So while myself and many of my colleagues and friends and fellow citizens are incredibly moved by the caravan, and we would love for it to have been made permanent, I couldn't help but think, as someone sort of on the back end of a lot of what's been happening, of all the stuff that actually has been going on in New Orleans that people don't know about. Because if you're not on the local level, you don't see the striving that has been happening to go beyond small plaques and do something more. So these are brand new, actually. This is a front and the back of a marker, and then you'll see a subsequent marker. This marker is to the transatlantic slave trade. It's actually across the river from where Walker installed her caravan. And this has been in the works for quite some time. This committee to erect markers on the slave trade is not a university-sponsored committee. It is made up of historians, community activists, and other people, curators who have been working very hard to get these markers put up. This year's our Tricentennial. So this is on the waterfront. So it just went up. They haven't had the ceremonies for it yet. And then also one to the domestic slave trade, which is sort of this one that went up in the back of the French Quarter. And this, again, a long time coming, has been in the works for several years. And so, but if you don't visit New Orleans, you don't necessarily know that these things are happening. But so, as we've been talking about, markers are very important, and they're site-specific. And so I think a lot of the challenge we've had is to try to think in other ways. How do we change the narrative? And so what I'm going to be showing you in quick succession are some examples of things that either I've familiar with or been involved with myself in this regard, but going through different mediums. Certainly, the removal of the Confederate monuments in New Orleans was a 2-year process, and it was ultimately, I suppose, it took a mayor in office who was willing to address the statues head on. But there is, of course, a very long history of people trying to get those monuments removed, which, again, gets glossed over in the national media. When journalists would call me to sort of get some backstory about what was happening, no one really wanted to hear about Take 'em Down NOLA and the people who had been fighting these statues before Take 'em Down NOLA, from the 70s. And nobody was very interested in that long view, but it's definitely important. This is something one of the protests Take 'em Down NOLA did to a statue of E.B. White, a Confederate veteran, member of the White League and upholder of segregation law. And he's kind of caught in the seam there, but the handmade sign pretty much explains his complicity in white supremacy and murder. This is at one of the protests, or actually this is one of the takedowns, maybe even, right before Jeff Davis came down. But one of the things that happened in New Orleans likes to celebrate itself as a city that can handle crowds very well. And actually the crowd, a lot of the crowd did not, despite the tension and the violence and the confrontation between white nationalists and pro-removal, the brass band often diffused the tension. They sort of made it a party at every site. It was literally true. And do you want to be with the brass band or do you want to be with the angry white nationalists? It was not much of a choice. So one of the things that came out of that removal actually was the Beauregard statue removal, which is in front of City Park, was this project called Paper Monuments. And forgive me for going so quickly, but I want to make sure you get all of this. So Paper Monuments, they've been in conversation a lot with Monument Lab in Philadelphia, and they've been helping them a lot sort of think about their strategy. But they commission artists and historians to put together these posters about significant people like Dorothy Mae Taylor, who was the first black woman elected to the legislature and then the first black woman on the city council, and she's known for desegregating the Mardi Gras cruise. And then Saint Louis de la Nuit, which is an enslaved man who became a free man. So stories like that, they're turning them into posters. They're collecting community ideas about which posters should be done, and then they're doing this, among other things, which is at the site of McQuarries sit-in near Canal Street. The building is actually still standing, and it just by great fortune, one of the terrible t-shirt shops on Canal Street burned last year, and they haven't been able to rebuild it, and so there's a lot of plywood, and so they applied the McQuarries posters to the plywood, sort of 1980s New York City style. And that's one of their strategies. They also have now a truck that's going around in neighborhoods and collecting people's ideas. They're asking community groups at libraries to draw their own ideas. Okay, 1 minute. Tripod New Orleans at 300 is a podcast that has an unusual structure because it's a collaboration between the Historic New Orleans Collection, the Midlow Center, and a lot of curators and writers who are coming up with new stories about the city and broadcasting them for the Tricentennial. This was our most popular one, so you might want to go and check it out. It got tweeted a lot. We decided we didn't want to retell the monument controversy in the midst of the monument controversy, but rather we found a story about a monument that never happened. This was to Oscar J. Dunn, who was the first black lieutenant governor ever, and there was actually a money raised for a statue to him that was never built, so that tells that story. Also, at the Historic New Orleans Collection, this is part of an exhibit they did, Purchased Lives, mapping all of the slave dealerships had never actually been done before in a very public way, so that people could come to the exhibition and actually see the massive diffusion of slave dealing in the city, in the CBD. That guy looks probably familiar to you on the bottom right, Adam Rothman. We had a conversation with descendants who lived in New Orleans around the time of the sort of largest Georgetown publicity. And it sold out immediately, engaging the public. It was free and open to the public. Freedom on the Move. Sorry, I'm running out of time. But getting my students to work on Freedom on the Move in New Orleans to change the way people think about the landscape of the city, taking stories of fugitive slaves and then going to those locations, taking photographs, putting it on a mobile app so that people find New Orleans historical, and this is another sort of medium through which you can get people to change the way they look at the landscape that does involve a marker. You're probably familiar with the Whitney Plantation Museum. I can certainly talk more about that if you'd like. And finally, there's an artist, Dred Scott, who is staging a reenactment of the 1811 slave rebellion. He's still raising money for it, as far as I know, but yet another sort of community-engaged effort to raise people's awareness and to change the story broadly and yet quite locally. And there's Robert E. Lee making his exit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I want to give a special thanks to Anthony Bogues and the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and everyone who's made this event possible. Also, I wanted to take a moment and acknowledge my grandmother, Lily Pearl Selman, who passed away in February. And so I want to call her up and think about my ancestors in the process of thinking about how we reckon with our history in the present. She was a woman born in 1929 in Mississippi, and she created so much possibility for me and for my generation, and her impact is, of course, incredible for me. So I wanted to talk today, and kind of being in this space is quite significant, the Rites and Reason Theatre. I'm thinking about the notion of how we perform our relationship to slavery in the present, and so thinking about theater's capacity to create creative engagement, but also civic engagement, and just theater's importance in our society. So I'm thinking about this as performing counter-monumentality. And this work stems from my own book project, where I look at contemporary dramas on slavery produced between approximately the early 21st century to about 2015. I'm looking at works such as August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean, Robert O'Hara's Insurrection, Holding History, and many others, Lydia Diamond's Harriet Jacobs, where you see contemporary dramatists kind of moving the neo-slave narrative to the stage. And so part of this work is in conversation or thinking about Hortense Spiller's in her discussion of how we engage with slavery today. And so she has an essay called Changing the Letter. And she says that every generation of systematic readers is compelled not only to reinvent slavery in its elaborate and peculiar institutional ways and means, but also in such a play of replication, its prominent discursive features. And so she makes the case that slavery is largely discursive, that the way we come to engage with it is found in our language and in the way that we talk about the specific character of the institution. And kind of moving away from that and thinking, or kind of building on that, we can also think of slavery as performative, right? Because slavery itself as an institution was an unnatural institution that had to be enacted as opposed to being something that was intrinsic to the way people live their lives. So when we think about that, it's performance at the foundation of slavery and the way that we continue to kind of see that play out, I think that a discussion on that is, of course, important. I noticed this too in my own research on kind of the monument building. So I'm thinking about the celebration, quote unquote, that just happened on Monday in Mississippi. Mississippi, Confederate Memorial Day, right? And in Alabama, I think the week before, where states continue to hold up this legacy and almost force it on the citizens, right, to honor it. They close down public buildings. And so there's this way, though, that I was compelled in reading some of the early 20th century scripts when the monuments went up. In many ways, they were performing mourning, right? That they were not just mourning the subjects of the statue, but they were mourning this way of life that they lost. They were mourning this new world order that they have to, or the old world order that now they have to be, participate in this new one. And so if we can kind of think about what happens when you go to a monument, what happens when you look at and engage with this history, it's akin to ritual and performance. And so in keeping with that, I want to think about what potentially could exist on the other side. And so I wanted to bring up James F. Osborne's notion of counter-monumentality that was particularly instructive for me in thinking about how I understood the way these dramas were enacting a kind of historical intervention, if you will. And so he talks about counter-monumentality and how counter-monuments embody qualities opposite from conventional monuments, that instead of being permanent, they can be fleeting and transitory. Rather than glorifying their subject, they problematize it. And as opposed to being a static representation for the viewer to observe, they actively invite and require participation and viewer engagement. And so I think Mary's explanation and what she offered us kind of gives us an example of that. And then we can also think of how this can work in performance. So my question that follows the Osborne quote is, what does it then mean to perform counter-monumentality? And so I contend that live performance creates conditions that align with counter-monumentality because of its ephemeral quality, its capacity to engage audiences in an active manner, and its frequent interrogation of commonly held views. Live performance exposes the reality that monuments are not static, but open to contestation and reinterpretation. So thinking about this, the fluidity of a monument and whether or not even putting a monument up in another monument's place is even a sufficient way to address that. And so 2 dramas that I just wanted to call our attention to. I don't know if anyone in the audience has read or seen either August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean, which is the central character is pictured on the left. And then Susan Laurie Parks' Father Comes Home from the Wars. Both are phenomenal plays that if they are in the area, I encourage you to see. But August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean in particular is a work that really engages with the ways that slavery is embedded in the landscape, the way that we kind of move around without even recognizing. And so the first gesture to that is the title. The title is a reference to the American patriotic song, Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean. That was actually kind of the first national anthem. But basically it celebrates America's vaunted history and its potentiality, welcoming people to the land while also kind of having, practicing slavery and engaging in that practice. And so by naming the play that, he's kind of revising our associations with that title. Amiri Baraka, too, has a kind of performance poem called Columbia, Gem of the Ocean as well. So August Wilson's kind of participating in this tradition of going into these narratives and rewriting. Also, Gem of the Ocean tells the story of a central character who's right there on the ground, Citizen Barlow. Of course, Citizen being another gesture to interrogating mythology of America. And Citizen comes to Aunt Esther, who is the community's 285-year-old ancestor. So we have to suspend our belief, right? He comes to her because he stole a bucket of nails from the mill, and another man died because he was falsely accused of it. And so he comes because he wants to get his soul washed. And in order for his soul to be washed, Aunt Esther takes individuals on a journey to what is called the City of Bones. And so the City of Bones is a reference to the Middle Passage. And in that journey, what Aunt Esther does is, instead of, August Wilson refers to the Middle Passage as the world's largest unmarked graveyard. And so he says in the play he wants to mark it. And so Aunt Esther, in continuing to perform this ritual of taking individuals to the City of Bones, is practicing a kind of counter memory of slavery, and also elevating and personalizing this loss and giving a more human face to it. She also has Citizen get a penny before he goes on the journey, which is a gesture to Abraham Lincoln. And then also she has him hold a paper boat, which is fashioned out of her bill of sale. So she's taking all of this iconography of slavery and reappropriating it to enact a different kind of memory of this history. Susan Laurie Parks's Father Comes Home from the Wars is also a similar kind of work, where the central character hero, again an ironic name, is asked by his master to fight alongside him in the Civil War for the cause of the Confederacy. And hero is promised his freedom to do this. So again, it's an incredibly ironic choice, right? Fight for the continuation of this institution and I'll free just you. But he does it, and he goes on this journey with his master, and he comes back. His master has died in the war. Hero is still alive, and he has news of emancipation. And the enslaved individuals on the plantation actually run away before he can tell them they're free. And so Susan Laurie Parks is doing another interesting thing and kind of elevating this discussion of Black Confederate soldiers. Again, that's a controversial history, but she's placing Black subjects in this dialogue in a way that they aren't always included. So when we think about those fighting on the cause of the Civil War, she's complicating this history. Also, she, across her work, engages with the mythology of Abraham Lincoln, the penny. She introduces that into this play. There's a character named Penny. And so she's, again, interrogating this history and causing us to see it anew. And so in closing, the question our panel is considering, one of the questions we're considering, is how should cities use public spaces to discuss, remember, and confront the legacy of slavery in the 21st century? And so I want to kind of point to the dramatic stage and live performance as a potential space to also engage in this work. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Just one thing that strikes me that all of your talks have in common is that you are all imagining memorials, monuments as living things. They're not just something that happened once and then just stays there, but they're either literally changing all the time, they're being remembered, there's a way in which people react and respond to them that makes them important. I'm just wondering if you wanted to say anything more about living aspects of memorials.
Well, I think it calls to mind a term that I actually learned from Professor Bogues, which he uses quite regularly in his work now, the living corpse. And so regularly, my students, when we talk about some of these memorials, including the new ones, focus on the fact that so many of them are testaments to violence and death. I mean, where I'm visiting tomorrow, the African burial ground is a site of extreme trauma and death and violence. So how do we get from that type of violence and death to bring something productive and living? And I think Stacey's example is a great way to do that, to make it about performance and something that can be shown through vitality and a living type of resistance that continues rather than being ruptured by this type of violence.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I was taken by in terms of thinking about this is the way that we continue to reinterpret history with new generations, right? That every generation, so when I look at dramas in the contemporary that incorporate humor, right, that in another time would have been seen as inappropriate, right? Inappropriate. Because humor, some would think, wouldn't have a place in a discussion or a presentation of slavery. So there's this way that we, that kind of humanity is a moving and shifting thing. So when we instantiate or put something in place that's more static, it's inherently going to be troubled. And so I think that really was something that was interesting to me in thinking about how we think about monuments in general, what purposes they serve, and their ephemerality, their ephemeral quality, in the sense that, you know, by 10 years from now, someone could approach a particular icon or image or statue and think something different. And so that's kind of what I was thinking about.
I'll also say that with the debate, the way it unfolded in New Orleans, it centered on the experts and the people who took sides publicly were politicians, historians, preservationist groups, monument defense groups, and artists were actually not included in the conversation initially, and they were angry about that because they knew that you're going to have 3 very central locations in the city, and you're not going to, at least consult artists about how those spaces would be filled. Historians shouldn't be creating, new monuments. So I think it was really important, particularly with paper monuments, that from the beginning of their project, they involved artists and got them collaborating with historians. And I also think it's important to think about where you're reaching people when you're talking about this issue of change over time and transience and sort of, so what we've tried to do is use the digital realm as much as possible, use audio, like the podcasts and things like that, posters, things that don't have sort of a permanent structure, but they get people really engaged in thinking about the city around them in new ways.
So artists is the other question I wanted to ask you all about, because so much of the work that we talked about is artists taking this on and doing interesting work with it. Whether it's actual, let's say, African burial ground in New York City with artists building a memorial, some playwrights, those posters. And artists and historians don't always get along. The mention of Confederate, the black Confederate soldiers, for instance. Historians just say, oh, no, not that again. Yes. But you can see why it would be very useful to an artist to talk about that. Can you give us any advice for that, this working with artists? You said that those posters, the paper monuments, they were artists and historian together. How did that go? I'm just asking for sort of advice. How did historians work with artists to make memorials?
Well, first you have to start the conversation, and that wasn't happening until it happened. I do think there's definitely a challenge when we're in these public forums and artists were there and participating. They did seem to have a very sort of different kind of response to the same sort of debate about who should be memorialized and who shouldn't, right? They had a much sort of more expansive view. So I think the most important thing is to bring them to the table. The way those particular posters are working right now is that historians are proposing ideas, and then artists are invited to conceptualize it and to create the art in response to the historical text. But what's interesting is that when the calls first went out, the response was the sort of knee-jerk response. People were sending in new people that needed to be made into paper monuments. But then, so they got sent back. Please think more broadly and more expansively. And then they started to get more submissions that were about events and institutions and organizations and things like that. And I think that works. It works better in terms of working with artists. It allows them more freedom to sort of think about what kind of representations need to be done.
It's interesting because in most of my research, I haven't come across too many collaborations of playwrights with historians. for different reasons. One of which I think is that when you're creating narrative in your artist, you might not necessarily want to have to be so true to one narrative, right? You want the creative space or room to create something new. And I think what's so interesting about the history of slavery and the engagement with artists and historians is that there are some aspects of slavery that are inexpressible, right? That we don't have. Stories that we might not ever have, or that could not be put into language because of the quality of the event. And I find it interesting that many of the playwrights that I look at are trying to imagine the things we don't have, as opposed to thinking about the things we do. What is being left out of this story? What new possibilities could we gain access to in reimagining slavery? For instance, Robert O'Hara in Insurrection Holding History, which is a play about Nat Turner, imagines a queer presence in that play. And Nat Turner's assistant, Hammett, is a queer enslaved person, right? But we don't have an archival source to go back to cite queer enslaved people, even though we know queer people didn't just come out of thin air. And so that is kind of, to me, an important intervention from the creative side into the historical, to think more expansively about the narratives we don't have, and imagining bigger lives for enslaved people than the ones that are documented, because they had full, rich, emotional lives that often don't get as much emphasis. So yeah.
I think the collaboration between archaeology and art is very limited, if at all, in certain contexts, and I think it's something that should be growing, and thankfully is in some ways. One of the things that it brought to my mind was in St. Croix. I was there for a conference just this past summer, and they're taking archaeological artifacts, little bits of pottery that they're finding on some of these plantations, and turning them into bracelets called chinnies, and they're made largely by African descendant populations to sell on the tourist market to people who are coming in on the cruise ships. And one of the challenges there, one of my serious reservations, is commoditizing this historical experience. So it's a very different type of interpretation and a truer collaboration between artists and archaeologists. And I'm hoping to kind of counteract that a little bit in a new project that I'm starting this summer. We're working on a plantation called Walker's in Barbados, which was the home of Governor Willoughby in the 1660s, when he was actually the sitting governor of Barbados and passed the very first slave codes, the slave codes that would go on to inform the slave codes here in South Carolina and many colonies throughout the US. And I'm working with a visual artist in Barbados to think differently about how material culture is contextualized and curated. So one of the challenges that we see, especially amongst young Barbadians, is why do we go from the plantation of material culture straight to the museum, straight to a glass case where it just becomes put on display in a kind of voyeuristic interpretation of slavery? So here we're going to think more critically about how we can create through this type of material culture and use have local Barbadian artists contribute to this dialogue, to think more creatively about something that we view traditionally as a scientific endeavor in terms of how archaeology is conducted. So I think it really will be a productive process, but again, since it's in its infancy, I don't really know exactly which direction we'll be taking this, which I think is kind of some of the power within this, the starting a new project like this in the first place.
With that mention of creativity, might be a good time to open it up to the audience. The question that we were posed is, how can cities use public spaces to discuss, remember, confront the legacy of slavery? And what I'm curious about is how to add the word creativity into there. Is there a way that you can make suggestions for us about creativity in that? Clearly I don't think we're going to be building traditional monuments. What are the ways that artists and historians and the other folks you mentioned, the politicians, were important in this? What are some of the ways we can work together, or what questions do you have that might lead us to decide? So with that, let me open up to questions from the audience. And I can't see because of light, so we have to. Anybody?
Thank you for the presentation. One of the things that we are doing in Salem and in the North Shore of Massachusetts is creating murals with paintings with slavery, and then making some notes attached to that, and then sending people back to do research about the paintings.
possibilities. Yeah.
So one of the things that struck me or that hit me in this was using performance in these, because the Karawaka piece, as you mentioned, was part of a citywide artistic event. And many cities, Providence has an event like this over the summer. Many cities have these civically engaging artistic events that are sort of saying, look at how great we are, look at how artistic we are. And I think that's a space where these sort of counter-memorial presentations would be very important, because you're politicizing a sort of apolitical civic celebration of its artistry and contemporariness or something like that. So I think that sort of integrating performance into those spaces would be a really interesting way to go about it, and to seriously politicize those sort of apolitical civil or civic celebrations.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I mentioned we're in the middle of our tricentennial, which is a whole complicated beast in itself, right? Is the tricentennial to attract more tourists to New Orleans, or is it something else? And I'm heartened to see sort of community historians, citizen historians, as well as sort of the groups that I mentioned, at least leveraging what they're doing through the tricentennial and trying to create more dialogue like that through these sort of high-profile exhibits and shows like that. And the city, in fact, I hope I get this right, they did not, they were not really involved in the putting up of the two markers that I showed you, but they are involved in, they have funded to some degree an app that will have various sites up to the domestic trade, and maybe the transatlantic marker in there, I'm not sure, is going into the app. So there's a little hint that there's a willingness to change the narrative for the tourists as well as the citizens.
And since you mentioned Kara Walker, I did just want to mention the Marvelous Sugar Baby exhibit that she did in Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn, which I thought was so interesting because she took over that space and people didn't know what they were coming in for. And once they got in, they see this huge statue or this construction of a kind of Manny Speaks, I think she calls it. And it was really fascinating to see people engage in that space. And I think kind of putting these markers in the unexpected spaces. So you have Brooklyn, which is undergoing this incredible gentrification. And so it looks different. Even when I was standing in line, people were telling me this doesn't even look like Brooklyn. There were no bike lanes when I lived here. And so this idea that she's kind of recalling this past in this space was really important. So I think your point about kind of showing these events and putting them in spaces where they're unanticipated, quote unquote apolitical, is an important thing to do.
Want to say more about the Kara Walker piece in New Orleans? I know I've seen the pictures of it, but never heard it and didn't know the connection with the scene.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you can go on YouTube and you know, Google it. What Kara Walker, New Orleans Caravan. It will come up, and there are other longer videos, and there may be some official videos. I'm not sure exactly. It was supposed to actually open the prospect for this year for the tricentennial. So, you know, that if that had happened, I think would have really set a tone that unfortunately it was not able to do because of the cost and a number of logistical issues with getting that very large heavy thing down and installing it. But yeah, I mean, she was there on site for pretty much all day for the 3 days in which the Caravan was performing. And I don't have, you know, again, if you Google it, there, you know, pictures change all the way around. People could walk around the space. It was quite loud. And I've thought often, if I write an essay about this, sort of retrospective look at the tricentennial or something, my ears are still ringing
And she warned everybody that it was loud. It had to compete with the steamboat nachos. It had to be in direct dialogue, and the only way to do that is to make it loud. Although the steamship nachos has never caused ringing in my ears, and it's right there too. So I don't know what it was. It was the wrong pitch or what have you, but it was very loud. People had to wear, what do you call them? Earplugs, thank you. Earplugs, because it was just this very piercing sound. But it was quite an event, and it was, I think, well attended, but could have, had it opened the whole show, it would have had an even more sort of pointed effect about the need to change the narrative.
I guess being loud is maybe a moral of that story. It's that to take back that space, you have to compete, and being loud is part of it.
Yeah.
Other questions about any?
I have a mic. I have a mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I wanted to, so thinking about this, if you think about art, I like to think about that as being, as telling a narrative, as performing a narrative, as communicating, right? So it's as a form of communication. And I would think of trying to talk about spaces to create, recreate, and reconstruct memory. So seeing Carol Walker's art, one of the things that I came to was talked about as the coffles. So that was a real demonstration of coffles, which I think most of us don't know about and remember, which is the marches from the East Coast throughout the South that established slavery throughout the South, and the actual walking of people with chains around their necks for over 50 years. We know about the Trail of Tears, but most people don't know about 50 years of marching. And so I was very struck by that being told, as a story that most of us don't remember or have any memory of. So I just want to know so that would be another way I could talk about how to put that in that line. But could you tell me a little bit about what was the public's reaction, if there was memory of that, and in New Orleans, because that is really what created the worldwide support of New Orleans through that.
Right. I wish there was more. I mean, because I guess this goes back to the art question. She's a very famous artist. She's one of our most famous living artists. And so a lot of the coverage of this installation appeared in art magazines and then in the local paper. And the local paper and the local weekly magazine, it was the art critic who was writing about it. And so I felt like I had wished there was another way for the public to really respond to it. The reception, again, much of what I'm thinking, what's coming to mind is simply reading art critics' response to her work, which is a shame. So I think that the prospect for it tends to be kind of an elite space. It's all over town. You can go to all different places. If you lived in Algiers, you could go see it. But it's not. It's an artist making a statement and trying to be provocative and being provocative. But it's quite different. I guess that's why I opened with it. It's quite different from the work that's being done on the local level, which is to try to create a network of community engagement through art and history together. That's not. She shouldn't be expected to do that. But I think she did plant some seeds, I think, in terms of getting the rest of us to think more creatively going forward.
Any other thoughts on responses to that? Go ahead, thank you.
Hi. So I wanted to just ask you to think a little bit with me about the public spaces question here, because I was struck by the mention previously about transforming public space into private space as a way of protecting, a certain vision of heritage. And also struck by you saying, sort of 80s style New York billboard, and realizing, oh yeah, that's gone, and thinking about the, sort of more guerrilla actions, in which, artists have obviously played a leading role. So those sort of non-state sanctioned interventions, and how that public-private space, is not necessarily a stable entity.
It's a really good question, a tough one that I've been thinking a lot about in New York, just having recently started to work there. But it brings me back to something that Mr. Boyd mentioned this morning in his keynote about some of these monuments and how when we have these debates about public or private, it's kind of easy to cast off responsibility. So when the Roosevelt statue is mentioned, this is right on the front steps of the Museum of Natural History, and there have been many protests surrounding the statue and its removal. And when I spoke with someone at the museum, and I could be wrong in this, but from what I heard, the statue is not part of the property of the museum. So they've kind of cast off responsibility to say, well, this is public, not private, not institutional, so it becomes somebody else's problem. It seems like no one wants to take responsibility for having that charge within their own realm of possibility. So I think what it comes down to is, it reminds me there's the work of geographer Don Mitchell is the book, The Right of the City, and who has rights to these spaces, and it comes down to public demand to have right over these spaces. So when we see activism of these spaces, without that activism, that Sim statue would likely still be there. And it's through reclaiming space that could be private, could be public, but it's demand that this is our space in terms of saying what can or can't be erected or stay in those particular realms.
Yeah, and I think in New Orleans, a lot of the early debate about what should be done with the monuments before they came down kept getting caught in this public-private question, who controls this land. At points, people thought maybe the State Museum might have had some investment in the monument in front of City Park, and in some ways it was an effort to sort of slow the process down to emphasize those sorts of things, and ultimately, and things about the National Register and what can and can't be removed and all those sorts of things. So, I think what is happening now is that, I should say this, well, where Jeff Davis was, that's just going to be an American flag, I think. The Beauregard statue, which is in front of the New Orleans Museum of Art, I think they're turning that space over to the museum to decide what to do. And I don't know what kind of process that will be. But the Lee Circle, which I didn't actually have a picture of in here other than Lee making his departure, very suddenly, Mayor Landrieu decided that paper monuments and the directors of paper monuments, Sue Mobley and Brian Lee, would be spearheading the effort to figure out what should be done with Lee Circle. This was after a very long time of their sort of lobbying the mayor's office, saying, let's have a process, let's have community engagement, let's do these things. And then all of a sudden it became clear, his book is coming out, and there's more discussion about it again, that what next question is coming. And so I'm really happy that he's chosen a sort of non-governmental, collaborative, community-engaged organization to try to figure out what should go in that space. And that's, I think, the best way in that situation to reclaim the space for the public, rather than arguing about who actually owns that traffic circle and who's been maintaining it. And the guerrilla-style stuff, I think, is also fantastic. And, we've all seen that on monuments everywhere, sort of people almost wanting to sort of preserve the spray-painted monuments as a statement in themselves.
And I just wanted to kind of situate drama in this, because one thing I didn't mention was that, of course, most of the dramas I talk about, you have to pay to go see, right? So there's a kind of public-private conflict there as well. And so what I'm really interested in seeing is whether or not artists like this who take up this subject matter will kind of offer performances free to the public, or put this in public space, or collaborate with government entities so they can reach a broader audience. So I really like what Dred Scott is doing with his slavery enactment. I think he's going to be offering that without cost in public. And so I think that's kind of a new horizon I think dramatists should not overlook. So it's something definitely worth pursuing.
Also, I just want to quickly, this came to me just a minute ago, in terms of the public land, I think there's a fear associated with what could potentially happen in public space. And one of the projects that I just thought of was Seneca Village, if anyone knows of it, in New York City. This is on the west side of what is now Central Park. This was a free black community that was evicted through eminent domain right as Central Park was first starting up. And there were archaeologists in the city who wanted to excavate this particular site. And through the Central Park Conservancy and through the Land Management District and Bureau, it took over 7 years to get the permits because everyone was terrified of what they could possibly find. And this was, of course, in the wake of the African burial ground. But it's gotten to a point now where this history is controversial and feared. And it's something that could be illuminated and celebrated. And I think that's the fear that many administrators feel is can threaten this kind of these spaces in general.
Other questions?
Over here. The flight's over.
I'm sorry, I really can't see.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, in addition to drama, I just came from Denver where I walked into a museum not knowing what we were walking into, and there was performance art for DACA. There were 3 or 4 people. It's an ongoing exhibit, and it is what I can't stop thinking about from the visit. The other is spoken word and using text from slave narratives, text from the past, but it's a way to involve young people as well and make it come alive and continue the dialogue with the next generation.
Question in the front.
My question goes on some of the things that have been said, but I'm wondering if there's a way to take some of the plays, the spoken word, into the actual sites themselves. So if you had a play about Sally Hemings on Monticello, at Monticello on the grounds, or if you had the Harriet Jacobs play in Eatonton or on a plantation, or if you had people reading poems in the African burial ground, what happens? What's the promise and the peril of doing that? I mean, it seems like it could be very powerful, but I would love to see something. I've never seen anything like that. I've seen, concerts on plantation grounds and picnics, but I've never seen
Weddings.
Yeah, weddings. But what happens if we use drama and art to reclaim those spaces?
Well, the one thing that a lot of people have researched is the slavery, and not the slavery reenactments, but the reenactments of slavery on plantations, like plantation tourism, I think that happens, where people actually dress up and they have people perform. But that's a different kind of thing, right? But I think that's the only thing that exists in kind of this site-specific context. And I think it would be fascinating to move some of the work that we see in these other informal theatrical spaces to the actual sites, to create a different kind of interaction there. I'm not aware of any that do that, but I think it's a great possibility.
One of the things is it's actually not up yet, but on our website /app New Orleans Historical, Xavier University drama students have been working on something like that, not necessarily specific to slavery, but choosing sites in the city and doing their performance, and then they are going to write entries for New Orleans Historical. They're going to post videos of the performance and documentation of the performance, and again, sort of giving it an extended life. They invited people to come, but by taking that extra step and making it digital and sharing it long-term with people, I think it's incredibly important. And just your question also reminded me of the performance of Waiting for Godot, which happened in New Orleans after Katrina. And it was incredibly powerful and happened, in sort of flooded, devastated, unreconstructed New Orleans, and was so powerful. And so I think that could be a model for the kind of work you're talking about.
The mic's here. 2 things on site-specific. I remember at Prospect 1 in New Orleans, at the pieces of the Ninth Ward, the community that was there was quite puzzled by these sort of airlifted in, rather exotic interpretations of what had happened in New Orleans. But it was very interesting to have conversations with them, and often I was involved with some of the church groups in Ninth Ward on cleaning up, and those conversations were quite fascinating because they were worried about it being sort of a ruin-porn bus tour through the Ninth Ward rather than engaging with the community, because the neighbors next door didn't even know what the piece was or in a conversation. But I did want to acknowledge 10 years ago, the center, the Public Works Committee, I'm remembering Lyra Montero's piece, 1,000 Ships, which we worked with Andrew Lisowski and Waterfire, where we took the texts of the slave-owning Rhode Island merchants and performatively performed them right in front of their homes in the midst of Waterfire. So we had 100,000 people who were coming for this nice thing in the city, and they were confronted with some pretty visceral texts with no preparation. We let the group sort of figure out, so there were sermons in favor of slavery and sermons opposed to slavery read in front of the places where those people lived at the time, and the family is still there, and some of them are buildings that Brown, of course, knows. But that was a really interesting project, and a very good book came out of it. That was done in 2008 as part of the bicentennial of the elimination of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes, throughout the South and perhaps throughout the country, there are a lot of reenactments of the parts of the Civil War, battles and stuff like that. Do you all see that as part of what you're proposing?
No. I would say no. Yeah, again, this kind of attempt to reenact history as opposed to trouble it, as opposed to complicate it, or even force people to think critically about it, I think that's what kind of is problematic. Yeah, some of these dramas that I look at definitely don't do that, and it would be really gratifying to see them go to a space and kind of combat that other attempt to reproduce a particular kind of history.
I'll just add, there's historian and anthropologist Mark Auslander, who's done a lot of work on interviewing the participants in some of these reenactments, and on both sides, of course. And one of the most startling elements is the reactions, what did you feel when you put on the costume or the uniform? And you can imagine those that had the pride of wearing the Confederate uniform, but for those who were playing the part of Union soldiers or the enslaved, it was embodying that history. And I think that's where you get a real disjuncture in terms of how history is remembered and embodied in those senses. So in terms of thinking about the reenactment, not necessarily just as a performance, but a ritual for the performers themselves, which I think is often overlooked in some of these contexts.
I'd like to ask you a question about the relationship between real public space and virtual public space. Because obviously there's sort of this feedback loop, particularly with performance art or ephemeral cultural production that then ends up on YouTube or then becomes viral, has an afterlife. And to the extent that, we acknowledge that nothing ever disappears from the internet, there's a kind of permanence there that is presumably as robust and perhaps more so than the monuments of stone and metal that were presumably going to last forever. It's now on the internet that things last forever. But obviously there's no substitute for actual bodies in actual space, for the kinds of politics that you were mentioning, Matt, and elsewhere. But I'm curious about how public historians and people thinking about memorialization want to utilize the internet, want to utilize virtual public space, and whether perhaps there are risks in over-depending upon, sort of in depending too much upon the website, the app, the viral Twitter feed, when in actuality we do need more bodies in real space, because that's truly how politics becomes effective in contemporary society.
Well, I can say that I take a little bit more pragmatic approach to the digital memorialization, in the sense that it's a dialogue between someone being in physical space and the virtual world, right? So we're expecting that people are using the app while standing on the neutral ground on Esplanade Avenue, and they're because everybody's on their phone, you got to find them where they are. You can have, if you have your location services on, it tells you what's around you. And in the case of downtown New Orleans, there's a lot of a lot of that has been preserved, but then a lot of other places, as they say in New Orleans, it ain't there no more. Things are gone, but you can install them through digital means for people's imaginations. You can describe them. We have students work. We have one student who did something on the Cotton Exposition, you know, and she worked really hard to sort of describe what it would looked at, and she even sort of orients the person reading the entry by saying, if you were to look to your right, you would see, you know. So I see it as a way to sort of engage people's imaginations that goes beyond what a marker can tell them. That's the way I look at it.
So just about performing in public space, also thinking, you know, about the public theater and its origins in New York, really as being a performance space that was free and open to the public. You just had to get in line, and you had a great picnic, and it was really, really fun. You know, that was long before they had any kind of permanent home and all of the performance spaces downtown. You know, and it seems sort of suggesting that there might be some models there. But I also think that I don't know if you are familiar with the YouTube series Ask a Slave. No? So this is a woman whose name I am forgetting, forgive me, who did work at Mount Vernon as one of the, you know, living history guides, you know, impersonating a slave on the grounds. And so obviously there was a specific kind of narrative that she was supposed to share with visitors. And then after she was done with that, she started a YouTube series where she sits in her costume, you know, and talks to various people and answers all the incredible questions that people really asked her while she was working at Mount Vernon. And I recommend this highly as a way, you know, performing in that virtual space that we were just talking about, you know, as a counter performance to those, you know, Civil War reenactors and living history museum people, you know. So that's not really a question. It's just I had to tell you.
It's well worth looking at. Check it out. I wonder if we could turn from the aesthetics and the artistic to the political, because that's sort of the subtext of a lot of what we're talking about here. That at some point in New Orleans, the mayor decided we're just going to do this. And I remember my first thought was, oh, it's really easy to take down memorials. Just get it made. It really isn't that big a deal if once you decide to do it. It's everybody said, well, how could you possibly do this? And I wonder whether any of you have thoughts on the politics of the community engagement on the one hand and the mayor dealing with things on the other, and how that worked in the various places that you've been. And then what advice do you have for folks who are thinking about either taking down or putting up the memorials? Where do you make the politics happen?
I'll start. Yeah, it was not easy. It was kind of a hellish 2 years for anybody that was considered a historian of the period and happened to be living in New Orleans, and the other 19th century guy at Tulane was on sabbatical. So that was a really tough year because yes, the ball, the mayor got the ball rolling, but the frustrating part was, as I think I alluded to, giving the grassroots organizations the props for really being the ones who have been working on this for so long. And it became, and it still is, a political sticking point. It is still a point of criticism of the mayor that he did not give the props to the long-term community activists. Take them down. NOLA is a new organization, but there are members of that organization that have been active for a very long time. Malcolm Suber is one. Leon Waters, who does the Hidden History Tours in New Orleans,
has done a lot of the research on the 1811 slave revolt. You know, the politics of it were very difficult. They were amusing at times because you had very prominent people who were opposed to the monuments coming down, taking out full-page ads in the newspaper, calling out Mitch. Mitch, I knew you when you were in short pants and you're just blah, blah, blah. You know, all this kind of crazy stuff. So there was all this theater involved as well. So in terms of giving advice to people about how to make this happen, I mean, it was such a complicated at times it went into the courts and everything stalled. So, I mean, it can seem a little daunting, but I think it is important to have political will at the top. But I think equally, if not more important, to involve the longstanding activists who are really the wind in your sails. A lot of the political theater, if you will, that the nation saw on television, that's because of Jacob down NOLA and certainly the people that wanted the monuments to stay. But they sort of gave a community face to the mayor's decision making in a way they did not get sufficient credit for, I think.
I think with respect to drama, one of the questions that someone posed to me recently was, why do we see so many people funding projects on slavery in drama? What is the investment there? And I think that for artists, there's a lot of tricky territory to make, to travel when you're attempting to get funding for a very radical project, right? Because on some level you want to please your funder, and on another level you have to question, why is this so popular with this particular person or this group of people? So that's kind of one caveat. With August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean, it's really interesting context when the play was performed. It was after September 11th, and so the city of New York was still in mourning. And actually, Gem of the Ocean closed early because audiences were confused with the play. Because there's a moment where Aunt Esther takes the cast the members to the City of Bones, and they're having this moment of mourning for enslavement while also kind of challenging America's complicity with it. It's just things that audience did not want to confront. And at the same time of this happening, because of September 11th and Ground Zero, one of the buildings actually had some remains from the African burial grounds in it that were found while the play was being shown. And so there was this real public uproar about why those artifacts had been stored in that building for so long. It had delayed the project. And so you have all of these issues around the politics of memory happening in New York at the time the Gem of the Ocean is taking place, or at least being performed, and it closes early. And one of the reviewers who talks about why audiences stopped coming to see it was that she felt like they weren't ready to confront that kind of mourning alongside the mourning they were experiencing, or other kinds of ways that August Wilson was kind of saying, here we are leading into war and we have not really addressed our own involvement in other kinds of mass atrocities. So that was one. And in terms of also bringing in the political, Susan Laurie Parks in Father Combs Home from the Wars, it was done in 2014, and one of the showings took place around the time of the Michael Brown verdict. The name of his killer, name is escaping me, Darren someone. But anyway, there was a lot of public uproar, but in the play, Parks incorporates a kind of hands up, don't shoot gesture. And Sterling Brown, the lead actor, is actually from St. Louis, so he had a very strong connection to this. So there are all these ways that politics comes into the art, and ways we have to think about a lot of complicated issues around it. So.
I'll just quickly add, to build on Mary's point, something similar happened in New York too, especially with the Sim statue. If you look at that little plaque that Mr. Boyd was showing earlier, it says that this was removed by Mayor de Blasio. So it's a similar silencing. It completely.
It's very strong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it was completely silencing the role of black women in protesting the statue for years. And it's a similar thing that happens with the narrative of emancipation. This was the gift of Abraham Lincoln and solely his responsibility, and it silences centuries of resistance from enslaved people. So the politics, it's a similar top-down model that has to be combated by those that are most involved. And we can see, in terms of what we can do institutionally, the case that I'm thinking of here is the debate around Silent Sam at the University of North Carolina. One of the things I think faculty can do, I think there was an anonymous letter written from 17 fully tenured faculty members saying, if the administration doesn't take this down, we will put up the funds and have this taken down ourselves, and we will suffer the full consequences if you want to fire 17 of the most prestigious faculty members. So I think there's a way where there is power in the solidarity that can go around this type of top-down approach to counter monuments.
Thank you very much. It is 1:15, so it's time to end. I'd like to thank our panelists. Oh, there's one more over there. Sorry. Okay. So it's 1:15. I was told to end on time. Thank you all very much for coming.